Echoes in the Waves. Chapter 1. The Midnight Encounter. The ocean stretched out endlessly, its inky surface shimmering under the full moon. The waves rolled in gentle rhythms, whispering secrets to the sands as they kissed the shore. Nyah walked slowly along the beach, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand with every step. The world felt hushed, as if the night itself had paused to listen to the ocean's song. She came here for clarity. The weight of the week clung to her shoulders, and the only solace she trusted was the vastness of the sea. Her long, flowing dress swayed in the warm breeze, the fabric brushing her skin with every movement. Her tight coils had come undone in the salty air, spilling over her shoulders in the wind. Then she saw him. A man stood waist deep in the water, his back to her, the moonlight illuminating his smooth, dark skin. The breeze teased the open collar of his white linen shirt, which clung to his broad shoulders and chest, wet and glistening. There was something about the way he stood, rooted, unmoved, that made Nyah pause. As if sensing her presence, he turned, his eyes dark and piercing, locked into hers. Even from a distance, Nyah felt the intensity of his grey gaze, a pull she couldn't explain. He began to walk towards her, the water slipping off his body, leaving trails of moonlit droplets across his chest and arms. "Are you not afraid of being out here alone?" he asked, his voice deep and smooth, carrying effortlessly over the sound of the waves. "I could ask you the same thing," Nyah replied, her voice steady despite the sudden fluttering of her chest. He smiled, and a pause quickened. His face, now clearer in the moonlight, was sharp and handsome, his jawline strong, his lips full and inviting. "Keenan," he said, extending a hand, his tone warm yet commanding. "Nyah," she replied, slipping her hand into his. His palm was firm and warm, and the brush of his thumb against her skin sent a ripple of heat through her. "Nice to meet you, Nyah," he said, his voice dropping slightly, rich and intimate. "Likewise," she responded. Her heart was pounding as his eyes lingered on hers. "Shall we walk?" he asked, gesturing down the shoreline. She hesitated, but only for a moment before nodding. Something about him felt irresistible, like the ocean tide steadily pulling her in. Echoes in the Waves. Chapter 2. The Stars Reflect. The waves lapped at their feet as they walked side by side, the moon painting their silhouettes across the sand. Keenan's presence was magnetic, his movements deliberate, and the warmth of his body radiating towards her even with the space between them. "Do you come here often?" he asked, glancing at her with a small teasing smile. "Only when I need to think," Nyah said, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. "It's the only place that feels big enough to handle everything I'm carrying." Keenan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that. Sometimes I come here to remind myself how small I truly am. It's humbling." Nyah studied him, intrigued by the layers beneath his calm demeanor. "And tonight, what are you looking for?" He stopped walking, turned to her face her fully, his eyes now softened by the moonlight, held hers with quiet intensity. "I didn't know," he said, his voice low and steady, "but I think I've found it." Her breath caught, the weight of his words settling between them. The sound of the waves faded into the background as Keenan stepped closer. "You're staring," he said, a playful smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Maybe I'm trying to figure you out," Nyah replied, her tone light but her pulse was racing. "And what do you see?" he asked, his hands brushing against hers, the brief contact sending sparks up her arm. "Someone who's not afraid to ask for what he wants," she said, her voice soft but sure. Keenan's smirk faded, replaced by a heat that made her stomach flutter. "You're not wrong," he murmured. His fingers grazed hers again, lingering this time. "Tell me what you want then," Nyah challenged him, her voice trembling slightly. He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of the sea salt and musk wrapping around her. "You," he said simply, his gaze dropping to her lips. Her breath hitched, her heart pounded as he leaned in. "Shall I?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the tide. "Yes," she breathed, her voice trembling with anticipation. When his lips met hers, the first kiss was soft at first, exploratory, his hands cupping her cheeks as if they might break. But as Nyah leaned into him, her fingers curling into his shirt, the kiss deepened and grew hungrier. Keenan's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space between them. The warmth of his body searing against hers. The world fell away, leaving only the sound of their breath and the relentless pull of the ocean. Echoes in the Waves, Chapter 3, The Sands of Desire. The kiss deepened, growing insistent as Keenan's hands slid down Nyah's back to rest firmly on her hips. Her body melted against his, her arms wrapping around his neck as if anchoring herself to him. The ocean breeze cooled her skin, but the heat radiating from him was overwhelming and consuming. Keenan's lips left hers, trailing a deliberate path down her jawline to the curve of her neck. His breath was warm against her skin, his teeth grazing the sensitive spot just below her ear. Nyah gasped, her fingers threading through his hair, her body arcing instinctively towards him. "You taste like the ocean," he murmured, his voice thick with desire, and his lips brushed against her collarbone. "And you," Nyah whispered, her voice trembling. "You feel like fire." Keenan chuckled softly, the sound vibrating against her skin as his hands found her thin straps of her dress. His fingers brushed them aside, the fabric slipping down her shoulders in a slow, deliberate motion. The dress pulled at her feet, leaving her exposed to the moonlight and the intensity of his gaze. "You are stunning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, reverence etched in every syllable. Nyah's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. She reached for him, her hands slipping under the open collarbone of his linen shirt. Her fingers traced the hard lines of his chest, the warmth of his skin igniting something primal within her. Keenan let the shirt fall away, revealing the full expanse of his body, broad shoulders, a chiseled chest, and muscles that flexed under her touch. He pulled her closer, his hands exploring her curves, memorizing every inch of her. The sand beneath them was soft and warm as he guided her down, their bodies tangling together. His lips found hers again, his kiss deeper, hungrier now, as though he couldn't get enough of her. Nyah's hands roamed his back, her nails grazing his skin as he moved against her, his touch sending shivers through her. The world faded, leaving only the sound of their breaths mingling, the crush of the waves, and the electric heat building between them. Echoes in the Waves, Chapter 4, The Tides Crescendo. The moon hung high above them, its light bathing their intertwined bodies in a silver glow. Keenan's touch was both tender and commanding, his hands exploring her with a confidence that left her breathless. His lips trailed far down her body, worshipping her in a way that made her feel both powerful and undone. Nyah's back arched as his mouth found the sensitive curve of her waist, his hands gripping her hips as though holding her steadily against the tide of sensations crashing over her. Her fingers tangled his hair, her breaths becoming shallow gasps as he continued his slow, deliberate exploration. "Keenan," she murmured, her voice breaking on his name, a mix of plea and surrender. He looked up, his eyes dark and blazing with the heat. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough but steady, filled with unspoken promises. His lips returned to hers, claiming her in a kiss that was much about passion as it was about connection. Their bodies moved together in perfect rhythm, every touch, every grasp, every whisper name building the intensity between them. The sand clung to their skins, the ocean breeze cooling the heat they created, but neither of them noticed. Nyah felt as though she were caught in a wave, pulled under by the sheer force of what they shared, and she didn't want to come up for air. "Tell me what you want," Keenan murmured against her lips, his hand slowly sliding up her thigh, touching, sending sparks through her. "You," she said, her voice trembling but certain. "All of you." His smile was wicked, his hands tightening on her as he whispered, "Then take me." And she did. Echoes in the Waves, Chapter 5, The Morning Tide. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting the beach in hues of gold and lush. Nyah stirred, her body warm and sated, the salty breeze brushing over her bare skin. The world around her felt different, quieter, as though the night had rewoven itself into something new. Keenan lay beside her, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, his arms draped over her waist. She turned her head, finding him already awake, his gaze soft but intense. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and rough with sleep but carrying a smile. "Morning," she replied, her lips curving into a soft grin. Keenan reached out, his fingers traced lazy patterns along her arm. "You are more beautiful in the sunlight," he murmured, his tone teasing but sincere. Nyah laughed, the sound light and genuine. "And you are insatiable," she said. "Only for you," he said, leaning in to press a slow, languid kiss to her lips. The sun climbed higher, the tide washed closer to where they lay, but none of them moved. The beach was theirs, The world beyond the horizon was irrelevant. Thank you for spending time with us to travel through a moment of imagination. As we close, remember to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our content with friends who might love it too. As your support goes a long way to help us continue creating these immersive stories, consider donating using the link below. We appreciate every bit of your help. We look forward to seeing you in the next story.